Gods of the Mountain by Christopher Keene. Narration by Justin Thomas James. Prologue. The distant mountains stood tall against the wasteland horizon. Passing the two guards standing watch, Faulk walked into the tent where Commander Gannerac stood. Gannerac's tired face looked into the lamp on the tent's table, the light of it dancing along his chiseled features. "Permission to speak, Commander?" Faulk asked. Gannerac nodded. "I've heard General Gannerac has never been defeated. Do you think you can beat him?" Gannerac's smile lit up his scarred face. "Depends if I can swing Skyturner in the right direction." He hefted his scythe-blade, a sword carved from the roots of enormous trees that had been located around Tyria. Hearing about the Scythe's unique ability to kill with a single cut, it was inevitable that the Avani Empire would attempt to take over in order to claim them. They had torn up every tree in their path in hope of creating more, but had only succeeded in turning the surrounding land barren. "Remember, Faulk, victory isn't always what you think it is. Sometimes you just have to be satisfied with making your point." Faulk balled his hands into fists. "They started this war. It's only fitting that it would end at the point of the very thing they started it for." Gannerac laughed. "True enough." Faulk turned and waved the tent flap aside to walk out into the night. Other tents surrounded him, and for miles around men surrounded them, each one armored with buckled plate and belted with sheathed blades. He searched the crowd, seeing worried expressions and rattled nerves on the faces of his comrades. A heavy hand landed on his shoulder, and he turned to see the smiling face of the massive, hay-haired, Saxorn mercenary. "And how are you, Bard?" Faulk asked. "Lieutenant, should be a good show tomorrow, don't you think?" "He's your commander, too. Perhaps you should show him more respect. He's fighting the duel tomorrow, so we all don't have to risk our lives." "I respect those who pay me." Bard led him to the nearest fire circle. "But I do have to say, he's a lot smarter than your average Tyrian." Bard received a few rough glares and angered groans from the people in the circle, and he raised his hands. "Not you. I'm sure you're all great scholars, every one of you." The two of them sat down. Across from them, next to Tegan and Lena the Spitfire, they spotted the cold gaze of the assassin Kessler. The man was hunched forward in his black cloak, eyes distant. "Kessler," Bard smiled at the silent man, "I hope you're coming to watch the fight. You can't be so high and mighty not to enjoy some good competition." Kessler shook his head. "I'm leaving in the morning. I will not stay to see the fall of a man who's risking everything to save his country." Bard blew a raspberry between his lips. "Bah, you're no fun." Faulk looked from him to the fire, to the stars in the night sky. Tomorrow morning might mark the end of this war. The sun rose over the desert the next day. General Gannerac's carriage rolled through the crowd. When it stopped, the door opened, and the large, crimson-armored general strode out. It was the first time Faulk had seen him, but from the way his mustache curved around his arrogant smile, he could tell he would not have liked the man even if he were an ally. People began to move behind him, and he glimpsed Gannerac walk through the throng of soldiers. The sun gleamed off his plate armor, but Gannerac's face was solemn. Nods and encouraging mutters followed him as he walked toward Gannerac. The two big men met in the center of the crowd. Gannerac sneered. "I hope you haven't wasted your spark on last night's drinking, Commander." "You will see my true spark soon enough." Gannerac drew his scythe-blade from his belt, showing it off to the crowd, but his eyes widened when he saw Skyturner. "Why, Commander, when did you get that blade?" Gannerac backed off, and his side of the circle formed, Faulk at his back. "One of the few you bastards couldn't get your hands on. Found her before this war even started. Gannerac took the hint and gestured for his own soldiers to surround him in the same fashion to complete the dueling circle. One of the first Psyblades. It's a lovely slice of death, I must say. I shall enjoy claiming it. The circle was sealed with each soldier holding a shield at its edge. Gannerac drew Skyturner, holding it before him. Come on and try. As you wish. General Gannerac didn't hesitate. He rushed in with such speed that Faulk gasped. Gannerac ran to meet him. Their weapons clashed, creating a ripple in the air as Gannerac disengaged Skyturner and slashed low. Gannerac parried and dodged another attack, his body seeming to blur. When fighting with Psy, Faulk knew that the first strike to land would without a doubt be the last. Come on, just hit him! Gannerac responded to his call, lashing out with powerful blows. Gannerac was much too fast, dodging with counterattacks that Gannerac could barely defend against. Bird smiled on the edge of the circle, definitely getting his money's worth from the match. Gannerac backed off, breathing heavily and wiping sweat from his brow. Not bad for an Avani fop. They circled each other. Every time Gannerac came within Faulk's view, he noticed how precise his fighting stance remained. His feet always in the same position, his sword arm outstretched. With all your bulk, it's not hard to avoid your blows, Gannerac said. Gannerac bared his teeth. But when I do land a blow... They met again, blades clashing. After evading several more attacks, Gannerac went on the offensive. Psyblades weighed next to nothing compared to ordinary longswords, and Faulk could see that using speed instead of power was a much more effective strategy. Even so, Gannerac's movements were unnatural. He tried to hide it by stopping every now and then, but his advances were inhumanly swift. It didn't take long for them to take their toll on Gannerac. Faulk felt panic as Gannerac met the edge of the circle where he was standing. His breathing was labored, and his face was flushed with exhaustion. "Commander!" Gannerac coughed to clear his throat. Don't let Tyria fall, my boy." He bounded off Faulk's shield and swung Skyturner once more. Gannerac blurred around him and stabbed him through his armor. "No!" Faulk screamed as Gannerac fell to the dust. The dueling circle crumbled, and soldiers ran in all directions, some drawing blades. The Avani soldiers formed a barrier around Gannerac's body, and Gannerac walked into it. He bent down and picked up Skyturner, studying it in satisfaction. The crowd went still as he spun with a large Psyblade in each hand. He grinned. "Your commander has lost the duel. By my hand, this war is over." There was a high scream, and suddenly Lena the Spitfire jumped out, her sword drawn. The Avani cut her down, encouraging yet more people to flee into the desert. Faulk felt stunned. There had been no trickery that he had seen. Gannerac had just been too fast, and Gannerac had been exhausted. It felt like his heart was tearing inside his chest. The world that he thought he knew, the world filled with the hope of victory, vanished. He watched with watering eyes as the Avani soldiers began to disperse. Gannerac passed him as he went to leave, staring at him under half-closed lids. "Pitiful. I was expecting an actual fight this time." They left him where he was, frozen in time. He felt Bard's comforting hand on his shoulder. "There was something really off about that general's fighting style, don't you think?" Faulk ignored him, feeling numb. Commander Gannerac had no family other than him, and even he wasn't related to him by blood. It was up to him to reclaim his honor. Blinking back tears, Faulk walked away from the old world. Chapter 1. 3 years later. "What a mess," Mullen muttered as he kicked the remains of a sliding door across the floorboards. "At least 9 dead, and one of them was a cleric. Now who would do such a thing? At his command, no one had moved any of the bodies in the brothel. The wreckage would be left untouched until he had completed his investigation. The room was littered with wooden splinters from upturned tables. There was broken glass and spilled ale everywhere, a hazard for any barefooted prostitute. Mullen caught his reflection in one of the small puddles, his black hair so greased back that he wouldn't be surprised if someone could see their own reflection in it, too.
"Apparently he threw that massive table with one hand,"
Big Ed, the larger and balder of his two assistants, murmured in amazement.
"It's made of solid ironwood. Normally would take 3 men just to lift the thing."
His other assistant, Gannerac Pry, a tall, long-haired young man, appeared beside him. Maybe it was 3 men. Certainly the chaos is confined to one path leading to the cleric's room, but it could have been a group of knife-throwers working as one. They all have the same wounds, except for the 3 that were thrown from the 3rd floor. Mullen kept his attention on his reflection and wondered whose skin would be paler and eyes sink deeper in the next few days, his or the corpses sprawled out before him. Big Ed's tone was enough to tell Mullen everything he needed to know. Ed was considered a giant by most people's standards, and if he was impressed by a feat of strength, Mullen knew he should be as well. Speculations, speculations. Ed, go find a few lucky witnesses for questioning. Mullen sighed and said, "Preferably someone who looks eager to tell us an interesting story. I'm going to need one myself to explain this to the Earl. Pry, you're with me out back." Turning swiftly on his heels, he moved out the same way he'd entered less than 5 minutes before, toward where the reason he had been called for lay dead in the gutter. The sun made the gelatinous curve of the cleric's rump shine with the wet gleam of his final bowel movements. Mullen pulled out a lavender-scented handkerchief from his inner vest pocket and brought it to his face to cover the rancid smell. "We can see the impact from the fall due to the crater on his head, as well as how much brain matter has squirted from his ears. But to distinguish who killed him?" Mullen trailed off, raising his brow at Pry and hoping his assistant would make a suggestion. Pry shrugged. "Maybe we should strip him?" Mullen knew it was really a question from the rising pitch in his voice. He nodded in agreement. The lanky young man had a few good ideas from time to time. Despite not really wanting to see the fat corpse naked, he gestured for his assistant to proceed, and Pry began stripping the white silk from the similarly pale body. Right away, he saw that there was something different about the corpse in comparison to those with the stab wounds. There were purple hand-shaped bruises on the man's shoulder and ankle. "Well, would you look at that? Handprints," Mullen said before pausing, giving Pry enough time to cut in. Right. Well, at least we'll know the size of the killer's hand for future reference. We'll have to harvest it and trace the size before the stiffness sets in." Pry brought out a small pocket knife and went about skinning the ankle. Mullen shook his head. "You're missing something very obvious here, Pry." "What's that, Inquisitor?" Pry asked, looking up from his gruesome work. "How powerful would someone's grip have to be to leave marks like this?" Mullen touched the purple bruise in awe. "I think we're looking for someone who can use Lunari magic." Pry's lips twitched into a wry grin. "Really? An Alper, you say? I didn't think the mountain folk came down into the city. Besides, they're too passive to do something like this." "Not an Alper, just someone who knows their arts." Pry shook his head in amusement as he stood up, hands bloody. "I don't reckon so. They don't take in foreigners and show them their magic. It's not a part of their culture. In fact, I think it's "Inquisitor!" The monstrous call came from Big Ed inside the bar. They turned to see him rush out and nearly knock over a prostitute standing in the way. "Watch it, you bloody gorilla!"
"Sorry, ma'am,"
Ed returned before rushing over to them.
"In the bar, one of the guards that fell off the mezzanine is still alive."
Despite the flash of joy that shot through him, Mullen's face remained professional. "Take us to him." They followed Big Ed back into the ruined brothel, where one of the white-armored guards was leaning against the stairs to the left side of the room. He was blinking dazedly and trying to remove the breastplate that Mullen was sure had saved his life. He gestured for Ed to move him to one of the bar stools that were still upright. "How are you feeling, soldier?" Mullen asked, trying to wake him up while still aiming to sound sympathetic.
"My chest really hurts,"
the guard wheezed like he'd lost a lung and then raised a hand to his torso. "I'm not surprised. You had a bit of a fall." Pry cut in, but then paused. "Wait a minute. Put your hand back down." Well, my theory of this killer wielding Lunari magic is getting better with every minute," Mullen said when he saw the deep handprint indented into the steel of the guard's breastplate. "You're not kidding, though. I'm sure this would have been enough to give anyone a little heartburn."
"It doesn't make sense. He just pushed me," the guard said with a baffled expression.
"Look on the bright side, Pry." Pry dipped his head in Mullen's direction, like he already knew what he was about to say. "At least you don't have to worry about preserving that bruise you went to so much effort to remove. You don't mind if we borrow this, do you? Well, now, of course you don't." The guard shook his head as Mullen helped him take off his breastplate. "Were there any other witnesses who could give us information on what happened?" Pry asked the guard, straight to the point as always. The man looked up, as though he had remembered something.
"The boy. After we were thrown out of the room, Ptolemy's betting boy was still with him. I didn't get a good look at the assassin's face, but maybe he did."
Pry smiled and said, "Perhaps he was there long enough to tell us if there were any words shared between them." Mullen stood and nodded. "Well, Ed, would you be so kind as to bring this man back to the House of Inquisition? I wish to see if I can coax any further memories from him." The guard's face blanched with terror.
"Wait, what? There's no need for that. I'll spill all I know willingly, I swear,"
he called as Ed picked him up and threw the man over his shoulder, carrying him out of the brothel. "Yes, I'm sure you will," Mullen called back as he lost sight of them and then used his scented handkerchief to wipe the sweat from his brow. "It's so hot today, but honestly, with the way he was shouting, you'd think I was going to cut his hands off." Pry had pulled another piece of parchment and some charcoal to get a rubbing of the handprint, but then looked up at him inquisitively. "Will you?" "Of course not," Mullen exclaimed. "Besides, the rack will do the job nicely. Now hurry up there. I'm expecting you to find the cleric's betting boy before the end of the day. Perhaps he can tell us what this bastard's face looks like." Chapter 2. Crouching in the shadows of the trees beside his men, Tegan One-Eye knuckled the sweat from the scar that crossed his left eyelid, the contents of which had been plucked out during the war. Beckoning him over with a wave, Faulk finished feeding the horses and jogged over. He hunkered down next to Tegan on the bank. "What is it?" "Shh!" Faulk turned and heard a trader's wagon getting louder through the veil of trees that hung over the track. No one had passed them since they had arrived, so he assumed that it was the wagon they had been waiting for. Tegan's heavy breathing nearly smothered the sound of the wheels crunching against the road. Faulk caught his eye and nodded to him. As the wagon rattled into view, he took the lead and jumped down onto the carriage track. The trader driving the carriage was a homely fat man with stubble-length hair shadowing his round head. Faulk was relieved to see that the wagon itself wasn't protected by any mercenaries. Someone must have tipped Tegan off about this trader's lack of protection. Security isn't a job that always pays well.
"Whoa! Whoa!"
the man called to his horses. Faulk grinned under his hood. The most idiotic thing the trader could have done was slow down, but he didn't know he was about to be robbed. Considering the guilty daggers had felled a tree and dragged it onto the track beforehand, he didn't have much of a choice. When the horses came to a halt, Tegan and his men emerged from the shadows of the bank, knives in hand, to join him. "Good morning," Tegan gestured with a nod to his men as they climbed onto the coach, pointing blades at the driver.
Okay, take it easy,
the driver called as he dropped the reins and raised his hands. 3 of Tegan's men had ducked under the drapes of the wagon and began rustling through the supplies. From this point, Faulk's job was to head down the track and make sure no one showed up to interrupt the robbery. However, he turned back when he heard a choking sound from the wagon. Faulk rolled his eyes as he noticed blood dripping from the coach. One of Tegan's men must have gotten overeager with their blade.
"Faulk, get back here," Tegan called.
Faulk ground his teeth in frustration and returned to the carriage to see that what he had assumed was true. The traitor hung half off the coach, blood pouring from his open throat and down his dangling arm. The young man who had stabbed him looked more confused than anything, as though he didn't understand why he was being admonished by the others.
"What happened?" Faulk asked. "I thought we were just going to tie him up, leave him in the woods, and take his cart."
Tegan scratched his beard.
Think of it this way. Now we have no witnesses. Come on, Faulk, I can't carry this heavy bastard by myself. Who do you think I am, a lunari or something?"
"You're way too seedy to even entertain that idea."
Give me some credit, Faulk."
Tegan pointed inside the wagon.
"Jake, Wick, use the ale in those drums to clean off the blood."
Faulk grabbed the man by his legs, and with Tegan at the corpse's shoulders, they began to haul him into the shade. He looked back and felt his mouth water as Tegan's men wasted perfectly good ale to clear away the blood of one of the nitwitted mercenaries' slip-ups. Carrying the limp body was hard work, and it was a relief when they finally laid the unfortunate traitor in the long grass under the tree. Faulk returned to the carriage, sighing in relief when seeing that only 1 barrel was needed to get rid of the blood. Not wanting to appear unprofessional, he convinced himself to not go looking at the bottom of it to see if there was any left over. "Get it together. After this, I'll be able to buy all the ale I can drink."
"Nothing about the job has changed, men," Tegan shouted. "Tossin, you wobbling tub of lard, get over here."
He beckoned the portliest man and his crew over to get into the front seat. Although it was a passing resemblance at best, Faulk assumed Tegan chose the one that looked the most like the traitor in order to avoid suspicion upon returning to Tyria. Being the last to climb onto the carriage, Faulk took Tegan's hand as he helped him up. Tegan grinned.
"I know I told you no one would have to die on this job, but
it's not the first body I've had to deal with from someone's blade slipping."
Good man."
He ducked into the wagon that smelled strongly of ale. "But it is the only death I've covered up with something I was on the job to get in the first place." Only half of the guilty daggers were able to fit with everything the traitor had stored inside. The other half would ride the horses out of the forest and would likely get their share of the profits later. Faulk had been able to avoid the gazes of Tegan's crew on the ride up. Now that they were locked into an enclosed area, he was forced to trade eye contact with people he would have preferred not to be on a first-name basis with. Tanned and sweating, there wasn't a full set of teeth among them. The one who had killed the traitor was sitting across from him, wide eyes peering out from under his hat. When the murderer's gaze met his, Faulk didn't avoid eye contact. Instead, he glared back and watched as the insides of the carriage suddenly became a lot more interesting to the man. "This is going to be a long ride," another of the guilty daggers said to a grunt of laughter from the others. When the log was removed from their path, Tossin clicked his tongue and the horses jolted into movement. Faulk was used to sleepless days while traveling. During the war, entire weeks were made up of nothing but rocking carriages. He would have slept if he could, but the constant motion kept him awake. The young man sitting across from him looked shocked that his cold expression remained unchanged. Faulk could see by his shuffling feet that it had scared him. "You seem a lot tougher when you don't need to sleep." His shoulders relaxed when the shadow of the city walls moved over them through the drapes of the wagon. Despite its tyrannical ruler, even Faulk had to admit that Tyria was still a sight to behold. The carvings on the high walls gave off a splendor that made the city look like it had been worked on by the known land's top stonemasons. However, upon passing through the gates, The guarded paths and dark towers would immediately drown these first impressions. Considering how rarely General Connacht's men patrolled the Lowtown stalls, Tegan's plan didn't involve entering the city proper. Located in the passages spanning under the city, Lowtown was where traders haggled with the shadier merchants trying to justify their long journey from Umeni. Tawson slowed the wagon to a stop outside its entrance, and the guilty daggers jumped down from the cart, desperate to put their feet on stable earth again. "I love this place, despite its smell of shit," Tegan announced. Faulk moved out from under the curtains and jumped down from the coach. He landed unsteadily, his legs a little wobbly after the long ride. "One could say it's the smell of freedom." Tegan barked out a laugh. "That it is!" They moved into Lowtown. The sound of the conversing masses mixed with the cries of children and the flow of the waterway, courtesy of the spring beneath the city. Faulk walked behind Tegan and Tawson as they made their way toward a shop owned by the merchant Simon. They passed calling patrons and wooden stands and entered the walled-off indent of his makeshift store. Faulk was there to ensure that they sold their stolen goods to him with force if necessary. That way, if the trader's body was found, the thievery and murder would be blamed on the merchant. "It's about time!" A balding, bespectacled man walked through a pair of curtains hiding a back room. Simon stopped as his eyes landed on the three of them. "You aren't Moore. Who are you?" Tegan rested his hand on the counter. "We're his replacements. Moore fell ill, so it was left to us to make his deliveries." Simon squinted at them. "Your proof?" Tegan pulled out an envelope and passed it to the merchant. Simon took the envelope and opened it, scrupulously reading the letter inside. "I apologize. You can never be too careful these days," he intoned, folding the letter and sliding it into his pocket. The job was smooth sailing from then on. Tegan, Tawson, and Faulk unloaded the wares, food, and barrels of ale. Money passed hands, and when they were far enough away from Simon's shop, it was shared out between them. "That letter must have been one hell of a forgery to get past him," Faulk said. "Ha!" Tegan put a hand on his shoulder. "Simon may know his numbers, but everyone in Lowtown knows that he can't read for shit. Now we can disappear for a while. I'll make sure to keep you on my list if another job comes up. You're as reliable as your reputation says." Tegan offered his hand, and Faulk shook it. He then broke off from them and made his way into the crowd. He walked through the passages of the waterway, up a set of stairs, and through the bustling main street to his favorite bar. The Turtle Shell Tavern was as dark and dank a place someone like Faulk could ask for. Somewhere he could hide away from the sun, somewhere to drown his sorrows, and somewhere he could make small talk with a beautiful bartender. "You're back, huh?" Laurie said, brushing back her curly red hair. "I looked away for a second, and you were gone. I look back, and there you are again, taking up the same space as usual." Being a long, narrow room, the dingy bar led out to an even narrower cellar. He knew that Laurie concealed a crossbow behind the polished wood of the bar, although he had never seen her use it before. Having already dedicated several hours to drinking, when Faulk looked up, a string of saliva linked his bottom lip to the wooden bench it had been pressed against. "I guess so. It only takes a few days, a job here, a job there, but I always end up coming back to my dear Laurie." "I'm touched." Laurie's lithe hands went to work pouring ale from one of the barrels received cheap from a Lowtown deal he had arranged. "Here, this one's on the house. If it weren't for you, this place would have already gone under. And believe it or not, ever since Tyria surrendered, I've been just as lonely as you have." "Thank you. There's nothing like a fiery drink to burn away the coldness inside." She pushed the drink down to him. Before Faulk could catch the sliding glass, someone's hand cut in and intercepted it halfway down the table. This woke Faulk up from his drunken daze. Someone taking away the first gift he had been given in such a long time made anger burn in him like strong spirit. "Who do you think you—" Faulk went to stand, but his feet got tangled in the legs of his stool, forcing him to lean on the bar. Then, Finally seeing who it was, he gasped. The tall, hawk-nosed man in a dark cloak downed his ale in a single gulp before slamming the glass onto the bench. "Kessler." His old comrade grinned down at him. "Lieutenant." The last thing he saw was Kessler's fist flying toward his face. When he next opened his eyes, his jaw felt too big for his face. He tried to move his arms, but found he was tied with thick ropes to a heavy ironwood chair. He stopped struggling as his blurry vision made out Kessler's dark form standing in front of him, arms crossed. "You see this?" he asked, a lit candle extending his shadow across the cracks in the room's stone walls. He pointed to a strange symbol scratched into a table that stood between them. "Look at this symbol. Engrave it into your mind." It was an arrow with a smaller line crossing it. He didn't recognize it. "Remember it. If you do anything while you're trapped here, you must remember this symbol. Think of nothing else. You'll never be able to get yourself out of this place unless you can think of this symbol and this symbol alone while in the darkness. Do you understand?" He didn't understand, but did glance at the symbol once more, engraving it into his mind before Kessler took something from his cloak and placed it on the table. He recognized the wooden weapon. It was a scythe-blade. Although carved from the same deadly material, like the vast majority of scythe-blades, this one was only the size of a dagger. "I see you're familiar with this." Kessler's gravelly voice sounded pleased. "That'll save me some time. You won't be able to see it. You won't be able to reach it, but you will move this scythe-blade. All you have to do is remember that symbol." Kessler grabbed the table and pulled it across the room toward the door, its legs screeching on the rock floor. He then walked over to the candle that lit the room. Faulk thought he saw concern in the lines of Kessler's face, but it could have been a trick of the flickering light before he snuffed out the flame. Kessler opened the latch door and left him there in the darkness. The darkness was deep enough that even after his eyes had adjusted, he still could not see a single trace of light. Although he could wait for hours in a moving carriage, his patience was wearing thin. He didn't understand what was going on. He hadn't seen Kessler since the war and had no idea why he had taken him to this place, or why he had knocked him out and tied him up for that matter. It wasn't until a few hours had passed that he even thought about trying to do what Kessler had told him. He had to calm himself enough to stop trying to escape physically and earnestly try remembering what the symbol had looked like. It had been a short line with an arrow across its center that pointed to the left. At first he tried to imagine it as it had been scratched on the table. Nothing happened. He then tried to imagine it as if it were an actual arrow with a shorter stick across its center. Again, nothing. Finally, he tried to imagine the symbol as if it were drawn in white over a black background. Something happened. As though the darkness in his mind intersected with the darkness of the room around him, the symbol began to glow. His concentration shattered at a low scratching noise in front of him. It had been the first sound not made by him since Kessler had left. He looked around, thinking that he had returned for him. No one appeared, and he could hear nothing else moving. "I heard it when I made the symbol glow." He tried to do it again, but with so many suspicions clouding his mind and pain still pulsing through his jaw, it was difficult. He was surprised by the effort it took to rid his mind of distractions, especially with how simple the thought of the crossed arrow was by itself. However, every time he imagined the crossed arrow as a light in the darkness, there was the sound in response. It was in short bursts at first, but he recognized the noise as something being dragged across a wooden surface. He then heard the scythe-blade fall from the table and clatter onto the stone floor. "Ah, ha, ha!" Imagining the crossed arrow moved the sigh. As startled by it as he was, he couldn't help but think that this was one of the Lunari powers he had heard so much about. "I could have sworn they were just a myth." His excitement faded, as after a few more attempts there was the sound of the small blade hitting the wall to his left. He looked up, hopeful that once he had achieved the goal Kessler had set for him, someone would come in to let him out. After what felt like another 2 hours, no one came for him. He was still trapped. He felt panic rise in him, terrified that he was never going to be let free. "Is no one going to let me out? I moved the blade, He trailed off, remembering exactly what Kessler had said to him.
"You'll never be able to get yourself out of this place unless you can think of this symbol and this symbol alone while in the darkness. Do you understand?"
He was struck by an epiphany as he recalled how the crossed arrow had been pointing to the left and how the sigh had hit the left wall. He imagined the symbol again, but instead of the crossed arrow pointing to the left, he flipped it so the arrow was pointing to the right. It scraped across the floor toward him, and he felt a thrill at using the new ability. By changing the arrow's direction, he could control the direction he wanted it to go. Spinning the symbol in his mind, Faulk moved the sigh blade until it was under his seat, but the rope binding his arms was behind him. He couldn't reach it. What's the point of this power if I can't use it for the one thing I need? He was about to give up when another idea came to him. What if the arrowhead at the end of the long line was instead on the end of the short line? He moved the blade to one corner of the room so it was less likely to hit him. Altering the crossed arrow in his mind, he focused on it with all his will. The sound of the sigh hitting the ceiling and then bouncing off onto the floor made him sigh in relief. He bared his teeth in a grin and moved the blade behind his chair, right behind where his hands were bound. He sweated in concentration.
"Come on now."
His first few attempts were too far away, underestimating the distance in fear of being cut. He knew how deadly it was just to be nicked by a sigh. Correcting it inch by inch, the blade clipped through the bonds on his wrists, and before long his tingling hands were working with the sigh blade to cut the ropes around his ankles. He staggered to his feet and stumbled forward with the weapon still in his grip. Remembering that the table had been facing the exit, he felt for it and used it as a compass to find the door. It wasn't locked, and when he pushed down on the latch, it opened. The light blinded him. His eyes adjusted to see that he was standing in a large hall covered from the earth under the city, as most of Lowtown was. Kessler stood in the middle of the hall, his eyes closed. Faulk walked forward, raising the sigh blade. Kessler's eyes opened.
"You got out. I'm glad."
"Glad? You knocked me out. You tied me to that chair.
I endowed you with Zex, the same way it was given to me, and trust me, there are a lot more symbols for you to learn."
Faulk stopped, brow rising. "There are more powers like this?"
"Now you're interested."
Faulk clenched his aching jaw. Kessler was toying with him. He enjoyed having the power to move the sigh and was interested in what the other symbols could do. Even so, he threw the sigh blade at Kessler. The blade stopped in mid-air between them and changed direction. It drew to Kessler's open hand, and he caught it by his side. He held it up.
"Not only for these. The symbols can make you stronger and faster, simply by envisioning them."
"You learned that from the Lunari, didn't you?" Faulk moved closer. "That's why you've been away for the last 3 years, and here I thought you were dead."
"I might as well have been. Nothing has changed since I left. I went to get the power to fight the Avani. I'm only here to pass it on to those willing to join me."
"And you're not going to show me the other symbols unless I be a good boy and fight the good fight with you, right?" Faulk stopped at his side and faced him.
"What do you expect? That I would just give them to you to do with as you wish? Or will you help me to change things, to avenge Commander Gannerac?"
After the echo of Kessler's question faded, silence filled the hall. Faulk knew that Kessler's question had too obvious an answer to deserve a response. He was interested in the powers because he wanted to avenge their commander. Yet he was still angry with Kessler. How do you think these powers will affect Tyria? Can anything good really come from them?
That's entirely up to your point of view.
Faulk smirked. I guess so. He continued through the hall, moving to the door despite not knowing where in Lowtown he was. Before he could leave, Kessler called his name. He spun and raised his hand just in time to catch the psy-blade Kessler had thrown his way.
Take it with you. Practice the symbol.
Faulk rubbed his jaw angrily and used the psy to tear off the forearm of his sleeve to wrap around its blade. He then stuffed it into his pocket and walked into the shadows. Thanks for listening. Have I piqued your interest? Leave a comment and let me know what you thought. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like and subscribe to get a weekly taste of fantastic indie books.